Hello and welcome to another episode of one of these Let's Talk sessions where we go through an aspect of RPG design with a focus on the Silver Age of computer role-playing games using these ugly-ass Google Sheets. If you are here for the first time, then it basically acts like these are all unscripted chats, just from a sort of amateur game design perspective, looking to deconstruct certain aspects of what makes RPGs good. It kind of takes the form of, if you've ever been on Twitch and you've seen somebody on just chatting, it's that sort of thing. What are we talking about today? Well, today, I wanted to talk about player goals and the creation of player goals from a design perspective. The two things that kind of set this up: one, I've been playing a mystery RPG that's I've said on here that we haven't yet covered, but I'm not sure when this gets released, so maybe it won't be a mystery after all. But I've been playing a game that I'm not going to specify in the video that has got me thinking about this, and also that there was something of a there was video. I talk a lot on this channel about the content from a guy called Tim Kaine, who was the lead programmer and really lead designer on the original Fallout, and on many of the best games from the Silver Age of computer role-playing games. Tim has his own channel, Tim Kaine, and it's very watchable. He's much more fast-paced than I am, and if you haven't seen his work and you're here on this, then I would encourage you to have a look if you're interested from a design perspective. I know some of you are merely interested in a skin of his teeth millennial just getting salty about things. So carry on if that's what you're here for. But the point is, with the reason I bring up Tim's content is that Tim was talking more about not when design has come to him, more from a programming perspective, I think he was talking about, and saying that the player will feel this or this. In Tim's view, in 2026, it isn't something that you can necessarily control. You can't control how the player will feel. I fundamentally disagree with that assertion as I've phrased it there. I'm sure that Tim himself would say that's a bit more of a blanket statement that he wouldn't necessarily agree with every aspect of. I think you very much can. I think you very much should try to. The one point I would agree with Tim on this is that I don't think you can necessarily assume that just because you've set a goal, the player is going to follow that. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So when we talk about player goals, we normally, or when we do any of these chats, we go through some core concepts. I've basically started recycling these. I'm not going through them each and every time, but you can look on there if you've not seen this before, if this is your first entry to these Let's Talk game design sessions. The main principle, I suppose, with this is that player goals are not tied to non-linearity. I'm not even really sure that they're tied particularly to tightness of design. This slide's a bit of a hang-up from previous ones. I think the two sort of most important things here really are the last two. So the player story, and like when we're focused on that, as it says there, we're not focusing on the character that the story of the character that the player plays necessarily, although there should hopefully be some overlap if your character's acting as a good protagonist and a good representation of the player. It's more about that player journey, what the player has discovered, what the player is focused on. Is the player feeling the emotions that you want them to feel, and are they engaged with it? And then the allied adjacent leveling systems. We're not going to focus massively on leveling in this. There's a separate video on that, but it's more to do, with having different systems that might work sort of alongside, and meaning that you don't have all your targets and, spoiler alert, player goals limited to one section. Why goal setting? So, the goals that a player has basically are the things that keep them playing a game. I always think that sort of goal setting is not even the sibling, but almost like the twin sibling of reward structure. Because reward structure is what you provide to the player in order to, I can't find a better way of phrasing it, reward them to keep playing, from continuing to play. Whereas goal setting is about giving the player reasons to keep going that are known. And in actual fact, while reward structure is very important and works hand in hand with goal setting, your goals have to be appropriately rewarded. I think it's the anticipatory value of goal setting that is actually the more powerful draw. We're talking about, I'm not going to read from these Google Sheets. You can read that yourself. But the premise here is that you need to think in any given moment, especially if you're doing something like most RPGs all RPGs that we cover on the channel, and most RPGs are focused on a story on some level. We don't tend to cover endless games on this channel, or sandboxes. We might change that in future, but generally we're focused on, when I say story focused games, the story can be relatively incidental. I mean, but the point is that it's there and there's an obvious sense that you're moving through it. If you want to move a player through your story, which, if you're making a story-focused game, you should be wanting that, then goal setting is how you do that, because it's the thing that keeps players playing your game. And if it's been a while since we said it on this channel, we're in the business on this channel about talking about how you would make games that are beloved. It's not necessarily about making games that will sell well, although you would hope that belovedness and sales do tend to go hand in hand. You're making something good, you would hope that the market would find that. But it's also about things that give your game a sense of, I was tempted to use the word depth there, but I think that's perhaps misleading. Something that makes players fond of your game in whatever way that might be. One of the games that I don't cover on the channel, I think about a lot, that's not even remotely story focused, but I would say it's very beloved, is Nine Kings, which is a recent sort of strategy game, indie. Brilliant game, and it gets a lot of love because it handles its various aspects very well. We've mentioned some things there which I think I'm going to cover in the other slide. I wrote these two slides separate. I'm going to call them slides. I wrote these two slides separately, so I think there's a little bit of overlap here. It's not restricted to non-linear games, but it is restricted to games where the player feels they have a choice and that their decisions matter, not in a crap telltale way, but like, you know, in a way where they actually are going to make a difference. If you don't have that, then it's very hard to set goals, and you probably, you know, you're looking for something there which is bordering on interactive fiction and not very interactive, you know. So player choice, it is, you know, whatever that means for your game is important. And I've also mentioned there that you know, a lot of linear games have their goal setting in the Act 3 stage, because that's where things tend to open up. Just looking at goals, God, I chose this colour scheme, so I'm going to have to live with it. That looks, even by my standards, that's pretty awful. This is kind of like a cheat sheet for how you identify what actually is a goal, because I think a lot of games, the reason that we don't have the clearly identifiable goals falls, you know, a little to the wayside, is not necessarily a lack of depth in the game. We'll come on to specific examples of more modern games later, but rather because there's certain bits of this are lost. The first point with this, goals are anticipated outcomes from player actions, and I really like it. If you want to ignore everything else on the slide, like, really drink in that one, that these are anticipated outcomes from player actions. You know, it's saying there on the negative side that this is, you know, unforeseen rewards don't count, and that's, you know, unforeseen rewards might form part of your reward structure, but they cannot be a goal that is there for the player, which means that you lose any of the one more turnism, I'll play for a little bit longer just until I get, with rewards that fall outside of the goal structure. That's not to say that you shouldn't have rewards that fall outside of the goal structure. A nice surprise, it is exactly that. You know, that's a wonderful emotion, but you're not gonna. You're gonna lose the power to keep your player playing if you are reliant entirely on unforeseen rewards. They do help, but eventually, you know, you want your player invested in why they're going to be playing for the next couple of hours. So goals can be tangential to the main quest, and frequently are, or not. Some things will be directly on the main quest. If you're involved in, you know, well, we'll come back to this one actually, because the next point, you know, makes this clear. Goals can be found in the mechanics or in the narrative, so long as they are anticipated actions anticipated outcomes from player actions. So we've covered. It's so easy to just keep going back to Final Fantasy VII on this, but like, you know, if you notice that your actions in the quote-unquote story sections of the game, the bit where it's not combat focused, you're interacting with the world in a more narrative focused way, if your decisions seem to be being registered and there is a sense of there being an outcome as a result of it. If I say this to Ares, what will she think of me? Will I be able to romance her later? Obviously, right on the opposite side to that, romance is a very specific example that a lot of players do not go for. And indeed, goals, are not going to be universal for everyone. But the point is that you can put goals in the narrative, provided that, going back to that first point, they are anticipated outcomes. So the only reason that dating Ares is a goal, like in Final Fantasy VII, dating Ares is a goal because it's set up in such a way as to register your actions in the narrative. Whereas if we compare it with Final Fantasy IX, there's no sense that you're not going to romance Garnet. It's just going to happen because that's the story. So it's not a goal. It becomes something. It becomes something that's like just part of a narrative to which you have no control. How does Final Fantasy VII achieve this? We'll do this again in more detail later. It's all to do with that flower that you can buy at the start. You buy the flower, and then later, you've got the flower. But we'll come back to that, as I say, in more detail. The point is that you can find this in the narrative if you appropriately put it there. But more frequently, you're going to find it in the mechanics. It's something. This is basically one of the cornerstones of the leveling up system of class levels, character levels, however you want to phrase it. That should tie into your goal setting, and we'll come back to that later. The other thing we've said, so this is responsible. They are responsive to player actions and strategy, but that doesn't mean that they're a strategy-focused RPG thing. Just because you're in a we can talk about game. I'm trying to think of games we've covered, like Knights of the Old Republic. We've covered on the channel. That is not a strategy RPG. There is very little strategy in that, but it still has goals, and those goals. Those goals are one of the things that pulls it along. I think if you're making a game that is low gameplay, it's almost more important to have goals. You just have to think about what those goals could be. Every time we do one of these, I go through, so I keep forgetting to bring up the tier list, and it's a shame. Maybe I'll put it in post, but I'll probably forget. I almost always do. Basically, I have a tier list of all the games. That's my personal preference, just so you know where I'm coming from on the channel, as to what games I think are really good RPGs, and what games I think are kind of lacking. It's obviously not a definitive thing. It's entirely, not entirely. I think it is a very subjective thing. But I like to put them out there so that you know where I'm coming from. And then if we talk about this briefly, we'll do some in a bit more detail. We'll focus on drill down on a couple of these games for some case studies. But I wanted to just talk about this and the general pattern of feel that we have with them. So just to run through, so Final Fantasy VII, obviously, this is a character-driven narrative rather than a strategic game, or particularly like an exploration-focused game or what have you. You've got, in terms of your goal structure, you have your materia system. So even as you're going up levels through fighting, you've got an idea of how you're going to get your materia up in levels. And one of the great, very, very simple mechanics that Final Fantasy VII does is just the pairing on materia. You know, if you've got, I think it's called Rune Sword or whatever, you pick up in the Nibelheim Mountains, that has 4 single slots and double materia growth. Or you could use a different weapon that has 2 joined slots, which is almost always more useful for your spells and things. You want that all, you want that elemental. So you've got a trade-off, but your goal is to get your materia up to the next section. The other thing it does, and it does it very well, and we are going to cover this in more detail, is the romance section, so we'll come back to that. The feel of Final Fantasy VII is actually, and this is a really core point with all these, it feels like the story's the pull. You know, you're being pulled along, like, I want to know what happens next in the story. This is really significant to what we're doing in goal setting, because the goals that Final Fantasy VII sets are very much a gentle trail of breadcrumbs. You're thinking about them. They're the things that get you through the bits when the story is a bit slow, and it adds even more pace when the story is there. So, like, I think one of the major problems, and when we come to the considerations section, we'll be going into more detail on this for sure. One of the major problems that a lot of indie RPGs fall into is they think the story's good enough. And it probably isn't. You know, there's been a handful of games, most of which are very short and, you know, like, that kind of dispense with other mechanics in favour of story. I'm thinking of Disco Elysium, I'm thinking of To the Moon. You know, even in Final Fantasy VII, which is, as I've said before, arguably the most beloved video game of all time, even if it's not, this is not the same as saying it's the best, but it's the or even the most popular, but the one that gets the greatest and most in-depth amount of fandom to it. Even then, you need to have goals pulling you along, so don't neglect them. Baldur's Gate 3 is Baldur's Gate 2, beg your pardon, is why have I not done that? Sorry, this is a So Baldur's Gate 2, I've put there with it. So this is more obviously a strategic game. We're focusing more on strategy and fights with a healthy dose of RNG. The goals in Baldur's Gate 2, it's really, really simple. It obviously it takes its systems from D&D, so this is true for D&D, but Baldur's Gate 2 leans hugely into this. It is a spell catwalk. You fight enemies, and those enemies use high-level spells on you. And you look at that and you go, God, I wish I'd had that spell. And it does this through these long, slow levels with, like, big steps up. You know, like the way it's laid out and structured, as I say, is to showcase those spells. The gear, most of the time, there's a couple of things with the gear where it's where you're buying things from shops. Most of the gear in both Baldur's Gate 2 and Baldur's Gate 1, which we might as well talk about at the same time, most of the gear is found on people. Baldur's Gate 1 relies a little bit more heavily in favour of shop gear rather than a spell catwalk, the spells being just a little bit limited by the low level. But the premise to both basically is that you've got something that you're working towards. And I think if we go back, I mean, obviously the playthrough I did of Baldur's Gate 2 and 1 was recorded in a much more clumsy setup than we're using now, so it can be a bit difficult to hear, let alone watch. But the amount of times we find ourselves going back to that character creation screen, not creation screen, the character profile screen, the character sheet, and just checking how much experience we've got, because that's the goal, and that's pulling us along more. I think that the first Baldur's Gate game is a little bit weaker with its goals. I think it's relying more on exploration and reward structure rather than goal setting. It's a known fact with D&D that the early levels are, amongst the least interesting, but pretty much across versions. So I think that's a pretty consensus view on tabletop as well. That like most games start a few levels in because the early ones are prone to problems. With Fallout 2, I picked Fallout 2 rather than Fallout 1 for some reason. You've just got this. You've got the perks. I mean, Fallout 2 was sold with a manual, and when you got that manual, it listed the perks in them, and it was created in such a way that it is assumed that you'd be looking through that, sort of salivating over what your next perk would be. So having a plan for that is generally where most of the reward structure comes in on Fallout and Fallout 2. There is a little bit of a sense of gear in terms of you're working towards power armor. But the other thing with it, I think, for me, is that like there's never too far from the next level, and that's the thing that's kind of pulling you onwards. Is that like you might as well play a little bit longer because the next level will come, and then if that brings with it a perk, that's fantastic. But you've got that sort of smaller thing there. Bloodlines. So I wrote this a while ago, and I'm trying to see what I mean here. I think the point that I was kind of hoping to make with this is that there's a certain, I think that fan service simply refers to the general level of sexualization within Bloodlines. What you're going to do with the characters, what that means, what's there. I actually don't think that the Bloodlines has terribly good goal setting. I don't feel like the leveling up sheet, the leveling up, like it's fine, but it's not exciting fine. It feels a bit more like you're kind of keeping up with the Joneses with the leveling up system, which is, you do a thing and then you get rewarded with points, but you're not necessarily like the leveling up points, the ability points, however they're called. They come at the end of you having done something significant, which means that the goals are normally just kind of the game, because you don't know quite what's there at the end. It's relying more on that reward system rather than the goal setting system. The one exception really being this, these kind of like fan service things and where the game interacts and responds back to you in terms of the world. Again, things it could have done differently. Three Houses, it is just an absolute wild time of stuff. Because you've got a sea of characters, a sea of plans, a sea. You've got visibility of the levels that are coming, and where you want to balance your party, your class. It's going to be an awkward thing to bounce between. Your students. I think that it does it really well. I think there's a lot there that makes me want to keep going because I can see what's coming. I also think, to be fair, that on the story side, there's a little bit, maybe mostly on the first playthrough, I think Three Houses implies a level of interaction in the narrative that maybe really, other than the major gatekeeping points, major sort of gates in the game that divert where your story goes, which are nevertheless impressive. I think that Three Houses, it implies that there's choice that isn't really there. But sometimes that's enough. You know, like if I manage to get all these right conversation options with Adels, what does that mean for me and Adels? You know, it would be, I mean, as I said, the other thing, wax lyrical on, that Fire Emblem Three Houses has a massive, massive, massive problem with its protagonist. Byleth is just a woeful protagonist and a woeful character. When he needs to just be like, you know, good at one of those things. He could be a terrible protagonist and an okay character, or he could be an okay protagonist and a terrible character. Either would have been fine, but yeah. Knights of the Old Republic's an odd duck, because you've got these character levels that you kind of focused on, and you know, you want to get your dual wielding up. You might want to get like I want to get this, you know, thing. I'll be able to get this. These feats, that's what they're called, aren't they? Feats. It feels like it works, but I don't. I think that Knights is one more turnism. It goes for a completely different tack on this, and I think it's just the shortness of the levels. I think as well there's an element of things being tied to the narrative. You know, I don't know, it sound really like basic, but like lightsabers are cool, or they were. People want lightsabers, and I guess maybe that's part of it. And it does, you know, you have an element of choice in that. Knights is doing things in a it's probably the worst example I can think of on here for me to handle. It's the exception to the rule, which is where the goal setting is quite a bit weaker, and yet somehow it still pulls through. Comes up at the top. Final Fantasy X Final Fantasy X is a weird game. I've said before on the channel of if you're going to cover one game from the sort of period we focus on, and just as a breakdown and talk about how interesting that is, I'd choose 10, because it just does so many things well, and then so many things just badly, and so many things just weirdly. And this is really true. I think of its goal setting. Like, it basically does very, very little with its goal setting until you get to Act 3, and then it just explodes. And it almost feels like in Act 3 you're just playing a completely different game. That you've been in this completely linear experience where the combat's dropping in and out and there's no real point, and you get like, oh, I level up, but it doesn't really matter because, you know, it's the same. You know, I've basically just increased in power exactly the same rate that the enemies have, so that it's the same stuff and I'm using the same abilities, and like, you know, yeah, there's one or two moments where it's like, oh, it'd be good when I get Haystega, that will make things easier, but it's a pretty small buff, and that's probably the biggest one you get in the first two acts. And then suddenly you're in Act 3 and there's just everything. You're like trying to find, you know, these celestial weapons, all the parts with that, like whether or not you can get the right items for crafting, where you go and get those from, like these, you know, just suddenly as a player you've gone from planning nothing and reacting to everything to just a game where it's just the plan and you're always acting forward on the plan. So it's an odd one. Baldur's Gate 3. Yeah, so Baldur's Gate 3, Baldur's Gate 3, before any other design consideration, I think it's really, I've put its principal genre pillar as character-driven narrative. It's not. It's let's just actually put it in here. It is simply, yes, trying 8 equals, trying to evoke tabletop. How do you set goals in tabletop? Well, the first way that you set goals is by players having a look at the handbook and planning out their character level when they get the experience. What am I going to do when I hit, I think it's 4th level, where you get your first sort of meaningful choice? What's that going to mean? Yeah. How am I going to build my character? My goal is to get to this level so that I can do this or this. I'm not sure that Baldur's Gate 3 does very well with this. Like, when you compare it to how Baldur's Gate 2 approaches this, I don't think there's something that I'm necessarily aiming for. I don't think, like, so for better occasionally and for worse more frequently, Baldur's Gate 2, which is really based off 2nd edition, I'm going to say, it's a bit of a mix between 2nd and 3rd, but I'm going to say 2nd edition, and Baldur's Gate 3, which is very just flat out is taking on 5th edition. You've got two completely different styles of doing things, and I do think for tabletop that Baldur's Gate 3 is better for this. It's all about the quadratic mage. So, like, the fighters, the rangers, the clerics to a lesser extent, and the thieves in Baldur's Gate 2, their power increases linearly, whereas the mage's power increases quadratically. So because basically, like, when the mage goes up a level, they get access to new spells, but as well as that, their old spells get more powerful. And as a consequence, like, you know, by the late game in Baldur's Gate 2, like, your fighters are not really there to do anything. It's just about your mages. Any fight of significance, it's the mages. Whereas in 5th edition of Baldur's Gate 3, like, it's a lot more flattened. Like obviously some classes are more powerful than others, some builds are more powerful than others, assuming, you know, the content that's ahead, but it is not reactively mitigating that. But things are sort of closer, which I think is a much better experience for tabletop play. The reason I mention it is that, like, in Baldur's Gate 2, it's all about this spell catwalk, and I'm not sure that Baldur's Gate 3 has anything like that. I don't feel like I want, when I'm up against other things in fights, I'm not like, oh, I can't wait till I get that ability. It feels a lot more like, right, I've gone up a level, I'm now more powerful. I don't feel it's as wild as Baldur's Gate 2. And I think as well that Baldur's Gate 3, like the whole thing of the rest of tabletop is that it is extremely reactive. It's what's happening in front of us now. How can we get through that rather than like how can we shape what will happen later? There'll be lots of people who have played tabletop RPGs who heard that and were like, that's not true in my game. Like in my game we plan and do this. And that's that's unquestionably true. Like people have games like that. But that's really, really, really hard to do in an RPG on a computer game. In a computer game that's based on D&D. You kind of, sooner or later, I mean, Baldur's Gate 3 is a tremendous achievement. It's in B tier, if you haven't seen the tier list, because I think it's a very flawed achievement. I think that there's lots of problems with it, but it is, a tremendous achievement. But even it can't manage to do that. So it tends to be a more reactive thing, and where things are in the moment, which is not aligning well with goal structures. Why is Clair Obscur to be confirmed, by the way? So this is an old tier list I've obviously copied from an old sheet. I think I put it in C tier. Give me 2 seconds. Goes to now. I did indeed put it in C tier. Apologies for that. Clair Obscur struggles. I think it's one of the... I think it's one of several things that Clair Obscur does kind of badly. I don't really know what my goals are in that game. Like, to defeat the Paintress, sure, but that's just the quest. It's not really a goal, that's just the quest. Like, there is the ability section, but as I've said before with Clair Obscur, like the ability section is, it's generally quite a muted thing. We found our preferred ability section very early on and just stuck with it. And now a lot of that is obviously me and how I play the game, but the fact that all the things are kind of poisoned on that tree, like the further you go up it, the more the trade-offs exist. It's not really a goal, at least not, I would say, not past like the very early stages. So yeah, I don't really know with Clair Obscur. Like it's kind of, it's getting by on its presentation, its style. And when I say style, like the stylization of it. And yeah, I think it would. Lots of people really obviously like Clair Obscur. If you like Clair Obscur, fair play. That's. I think many people on the channel do. Certainly the folks I speak to offline are big fans of it. I'm not going to lavish it with the same praise that I gave to Baldur's Gate 3. I think it's decent. I don't think it's a classic by any stretch. And like almost like the exact bloody opposite of this is Might and Magic 7. So Clair Obscur has all the stylization, all the production quality, all, you know, the feels, if you know, feels are something that matters, you know. And Might and Magic 7 has absolutely none of these things. It has, like, Might and Magic 7, like, was, like, it wasn't stylish when it was released. You know, it's incredibly, not just, like, ugly from a sort of, like, graphical textures point of view, although it is very ugly from a graphical textures point of view. We played the one with the textures upscaled just because it helps with the UI, and even then it looks pretty shitty. But from an art direction point of view, it's not great. There was a reason why things like Baldur's Gate 1 were like, oh yeah, this is gorgeous, this is how it's done, and then Might and Magic 7 just rocks up and it's like, oh, we're still doing it like this. It's like, right, okay. But what it has is this incredibly strong class growth system. And it's basically all it's got. And it's good enough. It's like it carries the rest of the game. Like the combat in that game is like nothing. It's bordering on an auto battler. The exploration's like, it's all right. It's not. I mean, you look at some of the other games on this list with exploration next to them. It's very, very low down. I'm not even going to talk about the story, but when you've got these systems, it matters, makes a difference. Morrowind, yeah, I mean, you might be anticipating what things that you build in. I don't really like. I don't know. Like I guess character levels, you want to get a mix of attributes, so you try and plan that out. But I find the goal setting in Morrowind is pretty dry outside of the enchantments. And the enchantments, yeah, they are where the real goals lie. But they're just so bloody, you know, like time consuming. And just, as I said before with Morrowind, it's just like why does it have just that, like, just pointlessly obstructive economic system in it? So like, oh no, like the, you know, the most gold that anybody's going to have, like, well, put the mud crab to one side because the mud crab is just like nowhere near anything. The most gold you're going to practically find anybody has is like 5,000 gold. Oh, okay, cool. Like, how much is this armor worth? Oh, it's worth 128,000. It's like, right, so it's weird. Yeah. Dragon Age Origins, yeah, early on you want these abilities, and then it's weird, and I'm gonna come in and say it and not mince words. It's weird and shit leveling up system. Dragon Age Origins, your leveling up system, I'm not going to mince words there, it's shit. Means that as you go further into the game, levels become, you know, less useful. You're probably better off not leveling up, which is just, you know, I don't know who thought that. And then Wizardry 8 just sits there. The only reason Wizardry 8 I think is really on this list is just to remind you, if people think like, well, you know, like, how can you say that, you know, Baldur's Gate 3 is a B tier game? It's like, well, look what an F tier game is. Yeah. I always do these case studies, and then, like, I kind of regret this because I cover it in the previous slide most of the time. We'll go through. So we've got like the materia system using growth. That is part of it. That is a significant part of it. But I think the more useful and interesting takeaway is the player ability to shape minor events in the narrative with narrative actions. It comes back to that flower. The opening hour of Final Fantasy VII for most players playing it through. In that first hour, first off, it just mostly establishes the world. I mean, I've done a separate video, if you haven't already seen it, on the opening to Final Fantasy VII. I think it's the best opening to any RPG. I think specifically that opening is actually gold. I'm not saying that Final Fantasy VII is flawless in many other areas, but I think like it doesn't. That opening doesn't get enough credit for the way it sets up the pieces organically that it's going to be using throughout the game. There is, going back to not just this list, but like the tier list, there is no other RPG that sets it up as well. Like I mean, you know, this lot. Oh, sorry, Koto, I didn't mean to exclude you. This lot, like, they don't even come close. You know, to say nothing of some of the things that's going on, like, down here. It really is, it's a spectacular opening. But anyway, in that opening, we bump into Aeris, although we don't know her name yet. She offers to sell us a flower. We buy the flower. Later, when we get to Seventh Heaven, we go in and Tifa notices that we have a flower. And then we can pass that flower to Tifa or Marlene. In doing that, in that small section, like, we've just established that choices that we make in the narrative, when Cloud is being given these dialogue options, the game is going to respond to it. Not hugely, but it's going to respond enough. We've also got, like, and it seems painfully bloody obvious, but like if we're the only let's say it, it's like young handsome man in the party, and there are two young handsome women in the party, then we might reasonably infer, and like the feel of the game, especially because we've set it up with giving people flowers, buying flowers, talking to them this way, you know, like, at some point, you know, Aeris is, well, it's not some point, when they get to Junon, like, Aeris is asking Cloud whether he likes people with tans or, you know, with pale complexions. We can reasonably infer that we have some influence over that. And it's not doing this in a, you know, that it's so bad, that whole telltale, well, Aeris will remember that you bought this. It's like, no, you know, it's not that. It's just organically there. We're just showing the player with like minor things, that many of which take, you know, very little time to program, and like a large portion of them don't actually do anything. But the fact that we early on establish that some things do things means that every time we do something like this, we've got to consider our actions. So the goal in this, I mean, like, I know it sounds really trite, that it's like, one of the goals is picking and charming your anime wife. But it is a goal because of the way Final Fantasy VII sets it up. And it's not a goal in Final Fantasy 9 or 10 because it doesn't have that same responsiveness to Tidus or Zidane's actions. And there's, only one waifu you're implied to be, chasing from the start, which is... It's not a criticism of them, it just means that they don't have that same goal structure because of it doesn't have that same setup. It's about the setup, and this entire section on goal setting is basically about setup. And just to talk with this, I mean, I had no sense of that whatsoever from Clair Obscur. All these facial bloody animations and whatever, but I just don't feel like I'm influencing the plot. There are sections later on, we can talk about the Act 3 bit when it opens up. But even then, and I also I've talked otherwise of why I think that the Eastern games tend to handle romance better than the Western games, because they integrate that romance in the story, whereas the romance in Expedition 33 exists in camp, which is just kind of right, okay, it just exists in its own separate world, which is just a bit, it's a bit shit. It's just not integrated with the narrative. Yeah. I don't want to spend a load of time on this because I think we've covered most of it on the previous page, but Three Houses, again, I mean, this is just about having lots of class growth options, and it's a key part of all this, visibility of what is coming afterwards. It works because when you are building, who was in our party with Blue Lions, when you're building Felix, there's no point, I know it sounds stupid, but there's no point focusing him down the Pegasus path on on thing 1. You don't build into that because he's not going to get it. You build people into the things that you want to build them towards, but you're working towards that goal. And when you go up character levels, you're trying to get people up, or rather character, but skill levels. When you get people up those skill levels, that's opening doors. So I think that's really, really good. As I say, I think that the way that Fire Emblem Three Houses handles these Final Fantasy VII style minor events in the narrative implies more of a result than you actually get. I would say I have a certain amount of sympathy for Three Houses versus 7. That, it's just I do really like Three Houses. I think it's a really good game, and there's lots to learn from it. but I can also see how it just was going to struggle to integrate things in with the sheer number of students and options and things into the narrative. So it kind of has it a little bit outside. Final Fantasy X, like, just, I mean, as I say, it's not the minor events in the narrative. It just all happens in Act 3. It's just like, it's such a weird game. Because you literally, I mean, like, obviously you've got the entire sphere grid, and so you've got plans for where you're going to put these points, what's going to go where. But you're not, or rather, you've got visibility of what's coming. But in the basic sphere grid and my recollections from the one time I used advanced, which is, you know, seemed like it's a complete waste of time. It's sort of set out for you for the most part anyway. There's a handful of spells or abilities that really make a great deal of difference. But when you get to Act 3, like, it suddenly turns into this, like, leveling up tapestry almost, where it's like interwoven. You know, you have to decide, like, what thing am I going to do? Like, I need to, for instance, I need to kill and fight Tonberry, I think it's Don Tonberry or whatever, in the battle arena, in order to get loads of experience, to get up levels. That's one of my bottlenecks. To get up, I need to fight him. But to fight him, I need to have Auto Phoenix. And to have Auto Phoenix, I need to go and get a load of Mega Phoenixes. And to get those, I need to be of a high enough level to fight the things that have them. And you end up in these circular patterns where you're aiming towards things. What's going to give you the boon to enable you to get the next boon? You know, I think it's really good. It's really interesting. Like it's a very, yeah. I think it's good. But it's not happening in the main. It's not happening in Acts 1 and 2. Not for like the first 30 hours of the game or whatever. You know, everybody seemed to like have a thing with like Final Fantasy 13. Like loads of people. I haven't played this for the record. I'd played some bad Final Fantasies by that point, and I was like, I need to step out of this. I'll come back when people are saying it's people who I, you know, respect are saying it's actually good again, which was a mistake. But anyway, the people say of like Final Fantasy 13 that it's just like it's really bad, but like it gets good at the end when you have more choice, more agency. But it's just so true of 10. You know. And like, I suppose in a sense it's true of 7 and to a lesser extent 9 as well. That everything's happening in the Act 3 stage as kind of part of the Final Fantasy games, you know, vibe. But I don't think it like anything like 7 and 9 have like they do layer things in. There are like layered goals as you go through, things that you want, things that you'll get. You I think it's done well in 7. I think it's done a lot less well in 9, but it's there. But like, yeah, in 10, just explodes into this. It really is. It's just like a completely separate game. Because like after, like in that Act 3, like Acts 1 and 2 is just like one very long cutscene with the occasional bit of player input, and then suddenly it just turns into a game. And then Might and Magic 7, as we said, wonderful class system that again it rewards. What's the other thing? A player plans mesh together as they try to find a road through. What I mean by that is that classic example. I forget who it is. It might be the Ranger. No, it's not the Ranger. The Archer. They need to go into the giant stronghold, Titan stronghold, to get the bow in order to get the quest. In order to live in there and stand any chance at the level they're at, they need the invisibility spell. In order to have the invisibility spell, they need to have a wizard with a high enough level to cast it. Well, we cheesed it, obviously, but like, you end up in this cycle of like, how do you do things? And that's, again, this is part of the goal structure. So normally I try and box these into considerations. These X's are just to let me know where to put things in. I guess a lot of this, to be honest, we've kind of set up with some of these, but like, we'll just try and hammer out a few. So the first thing that we'll talk about is narrative manipulation. We'll talk about challenge interweaving. We will talk about anticipating rewards. We're going to say it as rewards rather than think what really comes down to everything. What else? Other key things that kind of come up from this. Narrative manipulation, challenge interweaving. Is this really all we've got? Oh, that's a fairly dire set of things. We'll leave the other ones blank, and I guess we'll just open in this. So this is the Final Fantasy VII style. Where's my keyboard? Such a weird position. Final Fantasy VII Stickle. That's right. How do we describe it? Where? And anticipating rewards, I think we'll just say like 3. So, yeah, really absolutely hate the layout on that. Can I? Okay, thank you. Quite sure why it was set up like that. Yeah, I think that actually is there by design. Yeah. I think in terms of the narrative manipulation, like, if you want goals within your narrative, you have to suggest the player can shape that narrative early. And this is like the point with this, and is why Final Fantasy VII is a success, is that you've got to give these choices and show outcomes. You know, do a few early things early on, have a sort of trickle of things so that the player doesn't get sort of left out, but you don't necessarily have to have every. And in fact, I would actually go as far as to say that I would suggest it's better if games don't have every one of these choices being an outcome, because then it's not you're not working towards something in an organic sense. You're just like having you've created a sort of a story factory where you press button and thing happens. You know what you want is, and again, it's this wonderful thing with Final Fantasy VII of having a lot of these things be behind the scenes. You know, I've talked before about, like, I really hate it when we quantify the narrative. You know, you are now at like level 3 relationship with Shiel. No, don't, no. Like, I'm not. I don't. You know, I'm not gonna like go out for a drink with some friends later and be like, well, I'm at level 4 with them and level 2 with them. Why would you do this? You know, like, so why would you do this? You might do it. You might well do it if you are not looking to set up a relationship with the narrative. You are dealing purely in terms of a more strategic class system. You know, like if these are units, then that's fine to do. But like, Clair Obscur loses character. Its character relationships lose narrative weight by putting them in that bracket. So, you know. But anyway, I don't know why I'm talking about that, because that is not what we're here to discuss. Yeah, but you basically, yeah, shaping these choices, showing the player that they have agency early, matters. Because then you're setting up the system of goals, and then once you're out of that, again, maybe it's a bit trite, but like romance is. Let me be clear. Romance and we shouldn't do that. And it kind of, it depends what. It depends on the game that you play. if I, there are players who sit down to play, I don't know, like a Fallout game because they like the violence, and not in like a grotesque way, but there's a, they like that, the idea, the fact that it's dark and quote unquote adult. I mean, I don't think the Fallout games there's anything adult about them. Like, I love them. I love the first two, and I've played several of the others. Bad. Well, anyway, it's not the point. You take a player who plays those games and enjoys them like that, and then you say, hey, if you like that, you'll really like Fire Emblem Three Houses. It's like, I don't know. It's there's more overlap. Well, some players are just never going to play Three Houses because they look at it and they're just like, well, it's anime bullshit. And those players will never know just how right they are with that assertion. If you're doing that sort of anime bullshit thing and romance is almost implied in some level, then that's perhaps something that you can weigh more heavily in your goal setting. Like, if you're, I don't tend to focus too much on target demographics, but I think it's like, it's an implied thing with this at the scale we're talking about. This is directed at like conversations with other indie devs and would-be indie devs. Obviously, if anyone from AAA saw it, then welcome. That'd be wonderful too. We do cover AAA, but I think a lot of the time we're not trying to go for mass appeal here. We're trying to do a thing for an audience right, which is all that ever made Fallout, the most successful franchise and gaming franchise, I think, in the world now, or whatever, or the one that's made the most money. It's it's you have your audiences and then they'll go for it. So if you're targeting like an audience that wants this sort of thing, then it's obviously you style that in. Very long-winded way of saying this. It's been quite a long-winded video, honestly. Challenge Interweaving is really good. At creating difficult decisions that the player has to answer. However, because there's a big however here, it has to be more than, let's do that. One path wins. So the format on this is, oh, for God's sake. The thing with this, like player agency, I think is enabled by having many ways through a problem that are not as efficient as each other. I don't necessarily like one of the things that's sort of crept in with games a little bit, and it's a difficult one with RPGs because like, you know, or rather with computer game RPGs, it's obviously much easier in tabletop. You know, the Outer Wilds did this a bit, where like, you know, here's a problem. Like, you know, if you're a talking character, you can talk through it. If you're a shooting character, you can shoot through it. If you're a stealth character, you can stealth around it. And it's like, well, if that's the case, then it doesn't matter what I pick. You know, it's just like, well, yeah. Well, did I call it the Outer Wilds? I meant the Outer Worlds, but yeah. Well, so what, like, and this comes back to, I mean, you know, touched on this with the Final Fantasy X Sphere Grid earlier. You know, Sid Meier, I think it was, described you know, a game as being a series of interesting decisions, and what that's doing in the Outer Worlds and, you know, in the Final Fantasy X Sphere Grid, is a series of uninteresting like actions. It's just like uninteresting decisions. You know, like it's not, you've no choice there. But the flip side of this is that if you're in that like talk through, stealth through, or shoot through, and the only option is to stealth through, and that is that's your road in to the weave, that's a problem. Like, why I think Final Fantasy X's endgame does it quite well is because there are a lot of different ways in to the various paths. Like, you can, you know, grind through, you can go and get other abilities first that will, like, yeah, it won't make you invulnerable to the problems you'd face finding the next thing, but it will make it easier. You know, and there's this sense of progress that what you don't want to be in a situation with, if you're going to interweave these things in the way that those two games do, you don't want to find yourself blocked off by like one wrong decision or inability to do one specific thing. The other thing with this, I mean, like in terms of like anticipating rewards, like I guess just understanding the difference between goal setting and reward structure. Like, so your reward structure fulfills a dual purpose of encouraging the player and of managing the difficulty. You know, in RPGs, like if you think about gear and things, if you get the gear from doing stuff, it physically makes the game easier. If you don't have that, then you know that's there. But like reward structure is a lot. Reward structure alone is a lot less powerful in motivating the player for one more turn. So yeah, I guess, you know, like with this, there is a certain question of like, is there, you know, I'm just trying to think outside the box now, see if we've got any more extra columns we can put in, really. Is there such a thing as too many goals? I can't think of any game that's done it that way. I would suggest that if you've got like there's the general rule we talked about, and I can't remember which video it was, but we were talking about like character levels of like, you know, comparing something like Final Fantasy VII, which has lots and lots and lots and lots of levels, to Baldur's Gate 1, which has very few. And it's like those rewards become more impactful when there are fewer of them, but it's a kind of like a dangerous game, it's, you know. And I guess this is the case, like if you can set like many goals, it's going to be really hard to balance your game if those goals are all impactful. But I think when we get to that sort of conversation, like, to me, that's like immediately sort of coalesces into the question of like, what is your game? Like, if you're creating a game where there's loads and loads and loads of really high impact decisions that you can make that aren't necessarily like fail states, but you kind of, you know, you've got like, I don't know, like a very wide like sort of power differential. It's like it feels more at that point that you're making some sort of roguelike, but maybe you're not. I mean, like, but you've started to make something interesting, but you're going to have to find some quite specific ways of working with that. Is there such a thing as too few goals? Well, it's the Knights of the Old Republic question, really, isn't it? I mean, like, how are you getting through you know, like how are you getting around these problems? I think for me with KOTOR, it's just like, it's these short levels, there's some interesting quests, and there's some big characters, and it's Star Wars. And Star Wars, you know, I mean, I don't know how it is nowadays, like but in Knights of the Old Republic's time, like, Star Wars was still like quite a draw. If you did something in Star Wars, it was like, okay, that's cool. You know, like that. You're already off to a flyer. There was quite a few, honestly, quite mediocre games that like had a Star Wars license thrown on them over the years, and they were just, it was just more enjoyable because they were in that world, that vogue. You know, think about things like Dark Forces, or even really Jedi Knight 1 was like loads of people went hog wild on that. Like, it's a fantastic game. It's like, if that wasn't Star Wars, you wouldn't rate it. You know. So, assuming if you are an indie RPG that you do not have special permission from George Lucas, why is this? I feel like that's off centre. Oh, that's why it's off centre. Right, okay. Never mind. So yeah, can you get by with too few? Yeah, but you're going to have some things up your sleeve. And it's the whole point of it. It's like, these are the things that keep the players playing. What are your targets? We think about some of the other games that, you know, well, we've covered enough case studies here. I feel like I'm coming in at, like, for all this, it's probably an hour and a half long, this video, and yet I feel like I'm struggling to latch on to as many points with this as I thought I would. I guess yeah. If I come back to this later, I might think to myself, oh gosh, you know, I should have said this, I should have said that. I will either stick an addendum on the end, or perhaps I will maybe even just put like a pinned comment or some shit. What do you think about all this? What points would you add? What other things do you think people need to consider in terms of goal setting? What games did this well? What games did it poorly for you? How do you, as a player, manage your goals? How do you, as a designer, try and anticipate goals for the player? As ever, you know, the comments that we've had in this, I mean, I say every single time, you know, this is a tiny little channel that we're really kind of winding down a bit now. So I don't ask that you like and subscribe. Obviously, you can if you want. But the one thing that's really, really nice is when people comment, because it's just, yeah, it's just good fun to have a bit of a discussion over it. The comments thus far, whenever we do things like this, you know, we're trying to fight the good fight here. We're trying to make it so that people have more fun. So being respectful about like things like spoilers is just, you know, and everybody who's commented thus far has been really quite cautious with that. And, you know, big up to folks for handling it with like that. So let's keep the spoiler tags and so on going. Yeah, I suppose the other thing I'm going to sort of tag on to this, there's nothing to do with the subject matter. I'm getting to a point now as we wind down the channel, and things come out at a much slower pace than they did. It's been a while since I've asked, what sort of games would you like to see covered on here? And this is going to be a long-term question, because, you know, it's 2026 I'm asking this, and it might not, in fact, I'd go as far as to say it won't come out until 2027. But are there things that you're interested in? You know, things you'd like to see? Leave a message in the comments and we'll have a look over them. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.